Here at Disaster Breakdown, we've looked at a lot of different plane accidents. Now, just because most of our videos involve planes doesn't necessarily mean that things have to go wrong in the air. Planes have been known to crash whilst on the ground. Today we're going to be looking at one such incident. The case of Danair Flight 0034 that occurred on July 31st, 1979. It's a tale about negligence, botched maintenance, and oil. In 1965, reserves of natural gas were discovered off the coast of East England. For a long time, it was long suspected that the North Sea between Scandinavia and the British Isles held large amounts of natural resources. 5 years later, in 1970, British Petroleum discovered large reserves of oil out here, and the North Sea was never the same again. In the following years, oil companies from around the world descended upon these waters. Oil rigs went up, drilling commenced, oil and gas were extracted and transported back to one of a number of countries which benefited from access to the North Sea, the two big involved countries of which being Norway and the United Kingdom. Such infrastructure to do this meant transporting many people to and from the oil platforms and refineries. The easiest way to do this is by air. One of the main gateways to the North Sea was, for the longest time, Sumburgh Airport, located on the southern tip of the Shetland archipelago, northeast of mainland Scotland. The proximity to the oil fields made this the ideal transport hub for oil workers. The way it would work was workers arrived in on a larger, often chartered plane from Scotland, usually Aberdeen. From there, workers would transfer to their final destination in the oil industry, whether that be by helicopter, sea, or land. Discovery of oil in this region saw passenger numbers explode at Sumburgh's small airport. In fact, according to statistics, the late 1970s was the peak in terms of passenger traffic in the airport's history. Sumburgh was actually one of the busiest airports in the entire country at this time. A number of different oil corporations contracted with British air carriers to perform these flights to and from Sumburgh over the years, so there needed to be a plane that could operate at this small airport. The United Kingdom itself did happen to have one such plane that could fulfill this role. In 1977, the British airline Danair sourced a total of 7 British-built Hawker Siddeley HS-748 turboprop planes from Argentina. Energy giant Shell had plenty of operations in the North Sea, and so contracted with Danair to charter their HS-748s to and from Sumburgh. Amongst these planes was the aircraft registered as Golf Bravo Echo Kilo Foxtrot. This was the ill-fated plane. That kind of gives a background regarding the accident plane, but for this video, we actually need to look at and familiarize ourselves with Sumburgh Airport itself before we get into the specifics of the disaster. As already mentioned, Sumburgh Airport can be found at the southern tip of Shetland. The airport takes up a large portion of the land here, with the runways spanning in multiple directions, east to west and north to south. Additionally, there is a third runway used by helicopters. It is the east-west runway, runway 0927, that we're interested in today. If you look at satellite imagery of this airport, you'll see that this runway has water on either end. In fact, the whole airport itself is almost surrounded by water given where it's located. This runway, today at least, measures at 1,500 meters in length. The runway was extended a number of years ago, but at the time in 1979, it was only around 1,000 meters in length. One of the more interesting things about this airport, though, is that the main road route to actually access the terminal located here means passengers now have to cross this runway to reach the airport. So Sumburgh is a rare case of an airport that actually has a level crossing. I'm not kidding. Point is, this is the primary runway used at Sumburgh. It takes advantage of the regional prevailing winds, there are no terrain obstacles, and also this runway features instrument approach equipment. A shorter runway obviously means that the aircraft themselves are rather limited in size. The airport is primarily served by small regional propliners, so Sumburgh is an airport that the Hawker Siddeley 748 fits into rather well. In fact, for many more years after this accident, the plane was still a common sight there. But of course, we are interested in the case of Danair Flight 0034. Which brings us to July 31st, 1979. On the day of the accident, Kilo Foxtrot, the accident aircraft, was scheduled to perform 2 flights between Aberdeen and Sumburgh that day, one leg outbound in the morning, which was performed without issue, and the return flight in the afternoon. When the plane arrived in Sumburgh that morning, it spent 7 hours on the ground, sitting there, idle. Before the pilots left the plane in the morning, they ran through a procedure to properly park the plane as it would sit in its cold and dark state for hours. This meant applying the aircraft's gust locks, and this gets us moving in the right direction in understanding this accident. The gust locks. So, what are the gust locks? Gust locks are really only found on smaller planes, and similar to your car steering lock, it locks the flight controls of the plane. Smaller planes are obviously lighter and so are more vulnerable to damage caused by the wind. Gust locks prevent the ailerons, elevators, and rudder from flapping about on windy days. On the HS-748, the gust lock controls are located on the console between the pilots, next to the throttle controls. The gust locks on this plane are purely mechanical, no electrics involved. To keep it simple, there are 3 flight control locks on the plane. The lever in the cockpit actuates all of them. Fully down enables the locks, whilst fully up disengages them. There are detents along the channel which the lever sits in that catch the locks. The lever itself is not just moved forward or backward by the pilot. They must also lift the lever in order for the mechanism to work, then push the lever to where it needs to be, followed by a downward press. This sort of caused a lot of wear on the internals of the system. Now, when the manufacturer first developed the plane, beneath this metal housing of the console they placed what they called a gate plate. It was made of a synthetic material that contained a cutout of these indentations. This was the part that was known for wearing out. So, Hawk acidly notified air carriers that this should be replaced with a steel gate plate. This notification went out whilst the accident plane was with its previous owners in Argentina. When investigators later looked through the wreckage of the accident plane, they discovered this part of the gust lock system was installed rather poorly. It didn't really fit. This was only by a matter of millimeters, mind you, but it created an environment where there was insufficient interference, as the accident report puts it, between the gate plate and the gate stop. The gust lock lever, and thus the flight control locking system, could be put into a false range and partly re-engage or not fully disconnect. This damage was deemed not to be a result of impact damage in the accident, but instead the result of botched maintenance. Not only were non-standard repairs carried out on the gust lock system on the plane, but further checks on the aircraft in both Argentina and in the United Kingdom failed to pick up on this issue. So the aircraft continued to operate with a faulty mechanical gust lock system. This never caused an issue until July 31st, 1979. Picking up where we left off, once finishing the necessary checklist, the inbound pilots left the plane, and a new crew was to take the plane back to Aberdeen later that day. The pilots themselves, the information we have is a bit hit and miss. We only know the name of the captain. 37-year-old Captain Chris Watson had the majority of his flying experience logged in the HS-748. That is 4,500 out of a total of 6,500 flight hours. He was found to be a very competent pilot through training and exams. His co-pilot was, in contrast, very new to the aircraft. It appears the name of this individual has not been released, but what we do know about the co-pilot is that they were a 51-year-old man, and had logged 4,500 total flight hours by the time of the accident. Just 57 of those were in this plane. Due to low flight hours in the aircraft, Dan Air Company policy forbid him from handling the flight controls until he reached 100 hours in the aircraft. So it's believed that Captain Watson was the one handling the flight controls on the accident flight. The 2 men turned up for work that afternoon. Running through the checklists, the pilots powered the plane back up. The gust locks would seemingly be disabled as normal. The passengers and flight attendant boarded the aircraft ahead of the departure. A total of 47 passengers and crew boarded the aircraft. All 44 of the passengers were oil workers, all of them men. Another unrelated problem with the aircraft meant that the sole flight attendant needed to conduct the safety demonstration using a megaphone. The time was 3:48 in the afternoon. Flying as Flight 0034, the pilots requested their clearances. After receiving startup clearance, the pilots began their taxi out to runway 09. To get there from the apron, the pilots were told to hold position at this point, just short of entering the airport's other runway. The plane would hold position here for a total of 6 minutes due to conflicting traffic. Perhaps one of the more frustrating aspects of this incident is that the accident plane did not have a cockpit voice recorder installed. If you cast your mind back to when we discussed the accident of British European Airways Flight 548, we mentioned how the investigation into that disaster recommended that commercial aircraft in Britain be fitted with a cockpit voice recorder as standard, as that was a case where the investigation really would have benefited from the presence of one. The new requirement for a voice recorder only applied to aircraft exceeding a certain size threshold. The HS-748 was a plane below that, and airlines weren't required to fit one on smaller planes like this. So the thing is, we don't know exactly how things transpired in the cockpit of the Danair flight. It is likely though that during that 6-minute period when the plane was holding, the pilots would have performed the pre-takeoff checklists. For example, before takeoff, pilots should check the range of movement of the flight controls. If you have ever watched a plane at your local airport, you can clearly see when a pilot does this. They'll move the ailerons, elevator, and most obvious to an observer, move the rudder. It's a basic and obvious check a pilot would do. No one wants to go flying with inhibited flight controls. It's believed that the pilots did this check whilst the plane was holding. But here is where the failure occurred. The pilots did the flight control check as normal, but the poorly maintained gust lock system failed or slipped once the check for the elevators was complete. The pilot had pressed the gust lock lever back down into a false range. The movement of the flight control mechanism when the pilots were checking the flight controls slipped the locking system into a half-engaged state, so that the elevators were now restricted as if that lock was fully on. There was no indication to the pilots that this had occurred, and the pilots failed to pick up on the lever being selected in an intermediate state. The elevators were now locked, and the pilots had no idea. Because they did the flight control check and deemed the elevators to be working as normal, the pilots were none the wiser to the failure that just occurred under their noses. So at 3:57, when clearance was given for the flight to taxi into position onto runway 09, the pilots continued as expected. There was still some time before takeoff. The pilots needed to backtrack the plane into position. At no point during this time would they discover the failure. 3:59. Danair Flight 0034 was positioned on runway 09. Takeoff clearance was received, and the pilots powered up the engines. Now, because the runway is very short, the pilots held the brakes down whilst the engines powered up. Once the engines were producing the desired thrust, the pilots released the brakes and the plane began to accelerate. As normal, the plane passed the V1 speed, in this case 92 knots. V1 is usually the point pilots are committed to takeoff. At around 100 knots, the pilots were expected to pull the plane into the air. With his hands on the control wheel, try to imagine how he must have felt in that moment when he tried to pull the plane up, only to find that the control wheel was locked. The faulty re-enabled gust lock locked the movement of the elevators. He would have found that there was no movement of the pitch. It was stuck. For a period of about 5 seconds after the aircraft passed takeoff speed, eyewitnesses reported no takeoff. The nose didn't lift. The plane continued to accelerate. At a speed of 113 knots, the pilots did what seemed like the only option: tried to slow the plane down. At this point, the plane had exhausted most of the short runway. The engine power was shut, the pilots hammered the brakes, and they began to veer the aircraft to the left. Skid marks were left on the runway. Needless to say, they did not have enough room to stop. The aircraft went off the runway and crashed through a 40-centimeter high perimeter step. The landing gear collapsed. The aircraft then skidded across the perimeter airport road. In the final seconds before the crash, the plane dived over the inclined sea defense wall of the airport. The left wing made contact and was ripped off. The aircraft plunged into the sea in a nose-down left bank. The plane came to a rest around 50 meters out into the water. The plane did not sink at first. Within 2 minutes of the accident taking place, emergency services and first responders arrived on the scene, and survivors were being pulled from the aircraft and the sea. The plane, however, quickly began taking on water, and the nose of the plane began to sink. The water itself was shallow, only around 10 meters in depth, so only the front end of the fuselage was submerged in water. The tail section was left visible. This is perhaps the most tragic aspect of this disaster. No one died from the initial crash. Of the 47 people on board the plane, 29 passengers and the one flight attendant survived. They were either rescued by those in sea vessels and helicopters, or they swam to safety. In total, 30 people were left uninjured in the crash. The other 17 occupants, including the 2 pilots, weren't as fortunate. They sadly perished. They weren't able to make it out of the plane in time. This may have something to do with the fact that the front end of the plane didn't really have an exit. The main entrance into the plane was at the rear of the cabin. All of those who died in this accident died by drowning. The single flight attendant on the flight, her name was Elizabeth Coe. She was later recognized for her efforts in aiding the evacuation of most of the surviving passengers. In recognition of her bravery, she was awarded an MBE. In the aftermath of the accident, the investigation recommended that more planes be fitted with a cockpit voice recorder. Further recommendations were made to redesign the gust lock system to give clearer indication to pilots of its status. The airport at Sumburgh itself was also looked at. The British government was to work with the Coast Guard on rescue procedures at airports like Sumburgh, where the runway ends in the water. Sumburgh continued to be an oil transport hub for many more years afterward. Dan Air Flight 0034 wasn't even the last time an accident occurred involving an oil flight at Sumburgh. In 1986, a helicopter crashed shortly before arriving at the airport. 45 people lost their lives when mechanical failure brought the helicopter down. For more information, consider watching our video on the Sumburgh helicopter disaster. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to be subscribed as there will be a new video coming next weekend. Next week, I am planning on releasing a shorter video because I will be taking a day off to visit the National Museum of Flight in Scotland. I'm wanting to grab some footage of an airplane that is of particular interest for a couple of videos I really want to make. Can't really pass up the opportunity to not visit, really. Anyway, it is that time. A big thank you to my amazing patrons over on Patreon for their generous ongoing support to the channel. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you do see your name here, a big thank you to you. If you yourself would like to support the channel further, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new content 2 days before it goes out publicly on YouTube. Yeah, I'm going to keep this outro short today. If you would like more Disaster Breakdown content, consider checking out one of the videos that should be on the screen right now. If you would like to follow my personal Twitter page, that too will be linked in the pinned comment. Anyway, that is it from me today. Have a great day, and I shall see you next week. Goodbye.